The rain fell in an unbroken rhythm, painting the streets of Manhattan with a glistening sheen under the dim glow of streetlights. The air smelled of wet asphalt, distant food carts, and the mingling sense of hundreds of hurried pedestrians weaving through the evening rush. The city pulsed with its usual symphony, horns blaring, footsteps echoing against concrete, snippets of conversations lost in the breeze. But amid all the movement, amid all the chaos of one of the world's busiest cities, one man stood still, Ethan. Carter stood at the edge of a narrow alleyway, his polished black shoes inches from the puddles forming along the cracked pavement. His tailored suit clung slightly to his frame, the fabric damp from the misty air, yet he didn't seem to notice. His dark eyes were locked onto something, or rather, someone, deep within the alley. A woman. She moved with effortless precision, her fingers gliding over a weathered canvas, smudging, blending, defining. Her auburn hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, catching the glow of a flickering neon sign above. She didn't look up, not once, not even as the wind picked up, carrying the faint metallic hum of a nearby subway beneath their feet. Her world at that moment existed entirely within the strokes of her brush. Ethan was fascinated, not just by the painting, though the raw emotion in every stroke captivated him, but by the woman herself. The way she tilted her head, ever so slightly, how her lips parted just a little when she concentrated, the quiet intensity in the way she saw the world through colors and shapes. She was completely lost in what she was creating, and there was something about that, something he couldn't quite define. He was a man who owned the world, but had never belonged to it. Everything about him, his sharp jawline, the calculated calm in his expression, the subtle rigidity in his posture, screamed of power and control. Ethan Carter wasn't just another businessman. He was the CEO of Google, a name that carried weight across continents. He had built an empire on logic, on precision, on understanding the patterns of human behavior better than people understood themselves. Yet here he was, rooted to the sidewalk, watching a street artist paint in a forgotten alleyway. He should have walked away. He had an important dinner to attend, a gathering of elite minds discussing the future of artificial intelligence. The kind of event where the wine cost more than most people's rent, where conversations were polished and carefully curated, where everyone in the room pretended they weren't calculating their next business move. He should have been in a towering skyscraper, shaking hands with investors, discussing algorithms and market strategies. Instead, he took a step forward. The woman, still unaware of his presence, dipped her brush into a deep shade of blue. The color bloomed across the canvas, melting into the darkened hues of the city skyline she was creating. But it wasn't just a skyline. There was something different about it, something dreamlike, almost surreal, as if she were capturing the city not as it was, but as it felt. Ethan swallowed, suddenly conscious of how quiet everything felt between them. It was strange, this moment. A man whose world revolved around precision and predictability now found himself drawn into something unpredictable, something raw, something human. Then, as if sensing his presence at last, she finally looked up. Her eyes, deep, warm brown, met his, and in that instant, Ethan Carter felt something shift inside him, something he didn't understand, something he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. And then, she spoke. For a moment, there was only silence between them, thick, unspoken, charged with something neither of them could name. Then she tilted her head, studying him with a quiet curiosity, as if trying to decide whether he was just another passerby or something else entirely. "You've been standing there a while," she said. Her voice was smooth, low, touched by the faintest trace of an accent, French maybe. "If you're here to watch, you might as well step closer. I don't bite." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who hesitated, but there was something disarming about her, not just her words, but the way she said them, so effortlessly, so unbothered by his presence. She wasn't intimidated, wasn't in awe, wasn't scrambling to impress him like so many others did. When they realized who he was, she had no idea. And that, in itself, was refreshing. He took another step forward, his gaze flickering between her and the half-finished painting before her. "You paint the city differently," he said. Surprising himself with the observation, she raised a brow. "Differently?" He gestured at the canvas. "It's not just buildings and lights, it's feeling." A slow, amused smile curved her lips. "Ah, so you see it." Ethan wasn't sure what she meant, but before he could ask, she dipped her brush into another color and turned her attentions back to her work, as if he weren't the most powerful man in the tech world standing in front of her. He stayed longer than he intended, watching her paint, listening to the rhythmic strokes of her brush against the canvas. There was something mesmerizing about it, the way she lost herself in what she was creating. Time stretched, blurred, and by the time he checked his watch, he realized he had completely forgotten about his dinner engagement. And for some reason, he didn't care. Born into a family that expected greatness, Ethan had never known a life without pressure. His father, a titan in the corporate world, had instilled in him the idea that success was the only thing that mattered. Emotions, unnecessary distractions, dreams, only valid if they led to something tangible. By the time he was 20, Ethan had already made his first million. By 30, he had revolutionized the tech industry. Now, at 42, he was the CEO of the most powerful company in the world. His name was spoken in boardrooms, printed on magazine covers, whispered about in circles of influence. He had built an empire, and yet, he often found himself staring at the city from his penthouse window, wondering why none of it felt like enough. His life was meticulously planned, every moment accounted for. Meetings, acquisitions, expansion strategies, it was all mapped out, controlled, predictable. And then he met her, a woman who lived by no rules, who thrived in unpredictability, who created for the sake of creation. Lena had never known stability. Born in Paris, she had spent her childhood drifting between foster homes, never staying in one place long enough to grow roots. Her mother, an aspiring painter, had died young, leaving behind nothing but a collection of unfinished canvases and a love for art that Lena clung to like a lifeline. She had learned early that the world didn't owe her anything. If she wanted something, she had to fight for it, had to carve out her own path, had to make something out of nothing. And so she did. She painted in the streets, on walls, on discarded wood she found in alleyways. She didn't care about fame or fortune. She only cared about capturing the world before it slipped through her fingers, because she knew deep down that time was running out. She hadn't told anyone about the diagnosis, the slow, creeping loss of vision, the blurred edges, the dark spots that sometimes appeared without warning. Retinitis pigmentosa, the doctor had called it, a rare condition, irreversible. Someday, sooner than she wanted to admit, the world she loved to paint would fade into darkness, but she refused to let that define her. She refused to be afraid. And that was why she was here, painting in a forgotten alleyway, letting her hands memorize the colors, the shapes, the light, before they disappeared forever. As the rain began to let up, Ethan finally pulled himself out of his trance. He didn't know why he had stayed so long. He didn't understand why this woman, this complete stranger, had kept him so thoroughly captivated. But as he looked at her one last time, at the streaks of paint on her fingers, at the unwavering focus in her gaze, he felt an unfamiliar pull deep in his chest. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter, a man who had always known what came next, had absolutely no idea where this was going. Ethan didn't return to the alley the next day, or the day after that. Logic told him that whatever had happened that night, the inexplicable pull, the strange sense of belonging, had been nothing more than a fleeting moment, a curiosity, nothing more. He had a company to run, decisions to make, a life that didn't allow for distractions, and yet, 3 nights later, he found himself standing at the edge of that same alleyway, She was there again, of course. He had expected her to be. But what he hadn't expected was the feeling that settled in his chest the moment he saw her. Relief. Lena didn't look up right away, but when she did, there was no surprise in her expression, just quiet amusement. Back again. Ethan hesitated, then stepped closer. I had a feeling you'd be here. Of course I'm here, she said simply. Where else would I? Well, it was such a foreign concept to him, the idea of staying in one place, not out of obligation or necessity, but because it was simply where one wanted to be. He was used to constant movement, endless schedules, a life dictated by purpose and efficiency. But Lena? She just existed, right here, in this forgotten corner of the city, as if the rest of the world didn't matter. And for some reason, that terrified him, and fascinated him all the same. Ethan didn't understand why he kept coming back. Every evening, after long meetings and calculated negotiations, after hours of being surrounded by some of the most powerful minds in the world, he found himself drawn to her. He would arrive without a plan, without a reason, without knowing what he was expecting to find. But she was always there, always painting, always so completely lost in what she was doing that it made him feel like he was the one who had been missing something his whole life. And slowly, without either of them acknowledging it, a pattern began to form. He would bring her coffee, black, no sugar, the way she liked it. She would tease him for wearing suits in an alley. He would watch her paint, sometimes speaking, sometimes in silence. And somewhere between those quiet moments, something shifted. She told him about her mother, about growing up in Paris, about the paintings she had left behind. She spoke about her love for the city, for its imperfections, for the way light changed. Everything. And Ethan? He told her things he had never told anyone, not because she asked, but because for the first time in his life, someone looked at him as if he were a person and not a title. He told her about his father's expectations, about how he had spent his entire life chasing a version of success that had never felt like his. He told her about the suffocating weight of power, about how sometimes, in the silence of his penthouse, he wondered if he had made a mistake somewhere along the way. And when he finished speaking, she didn't offer him solutions. She just looked at him, long and quiet, and said, "Then stop." "Stop?" He almost laughed, as if it were that simple. But she meant it, and that was the moment he realized she was different. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, wasn't in awe of his power. She didn't see him as the tech mogul who had reshaped the modern world. She just saw him, and that terrified him even more. One evening, as Ethan arrived, he noticed something different. Lena was struggling. Her hand, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she moved her brush. Her focus wavered, her strokes not as sure. And then, as she reached for a different color, she hesitated. Ethan watched, his sharp eyes catching the almost imperceptible shake in her fingers. And then, he understood. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something else. She knew he had seen it. For the first time, she looked unsettled, as if she had been caught revealing something she had worked so hard to hide. Ethan took a step closer. "Lena," she set down her brush. "Don't. You're sick." It wasn't a question. Lena exhaled slowly, leaning against the old brick wall. She crossed her arms, tilting her head as she studied him. "And what if I am?" He could fix this. That was the first thought that ran through his mind. He had the resources, the connections, the money. He could find the best specialists, fund research, do something. But then he saw the look in her eyes, and he realized this wasn't something he could buy his way out of. Lena smiled faintly, but there was a sadness behind it. "Not everything can be solved, Ethan." He clenched his jaw. "There has to be a way." "There isn't." A beat of silence, and then, softer, "I don't need saving." Ethan had never felt helpless before, not once in his entire life. He was a man who made things happen, who fixed things, who controlled things. But standing in front of her now, he realized he had no control over this, and that scared him more than anything ever had. Lena didn't want his money. She didn't want his influence. She didn't want his carefully curated world. She just wanted to live, to paint, to see for as long as she could, and Ethan, for the first time in his life, didn't know what to do. But he knew one thing: he wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. Not ever. Ethan had always believed that every problem had a solution. It was how he had built his empire, through strategy, through control, through sheer force of will. There was nothing in the world that couldn't be fixed, nothing that couldn't be bent to his will with the right amount of money, power, or influence. But Lena was proving him wrong, and it was killing him. He spent nights researching, calling specialists, funding research. There were experimental treatments, risky procedures, shadowy medical firms that promised miracles for the right price. He poured himself into fixing her the way he would fix a failing company. But no matter how many late-night phone calls he made, no matter how many zeros he was willing to add to a check, nothing changed. Retinitis pigmentosa. No cure, no reversal, no escape. And the more he fought against it, the more Lena pulled away. She knew what he was doing. She saw it in the exhaustion lining his face, in the restless energy in his hands, in the way he looked at her like she was something fragile, something slipping through his fingers. And she hated it. She had spent her whole life surviving, making peace with the unfairness of the world. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be treated like a problem to be solved. She just wanted to live on her own terms. So she made a choice. She disappeared. Ethan arrived at the alley, coffee in hand, only to find the space empty. No canvas, no paints, no Lena. His pulse kicked up, his body going rigid. He called her, no answer. He checked every street corner, every cafe, every art gallery he knew she loved. Nothing. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter experienced real fear, not the fear of failure or of public scrutiny or of making the wrong business move. This was different. This was losing something he couldn't replace. Hours passed, then a full day, then 2, and then, finally, he found her. She was standing by the Brooklyn Bridge, her hair wild in the night wind, her hands shoved into the pockets of an old paint-stained jacket. The city stretched behind her, lights shimmering over the dark. River, a world that was slowly disappearing from her vision. Ethan didn't speak at first. He just stood there, breathing hard, chest tight. You left. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something raw beneath it, something cracking. Lena turned, her expression unreadable. I had to. His fists clenched. Why? Because you don't know how to let go, she said quietly. You're trying to fight something you can't win, and I won't let you destroy yourself over me. The words hit him like a punch. Destroy himself. Didn't she see? Didn't she understand? She was the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. I can fix this, he said, and he hated how desperate he sounded. She shook her head, stepping closer. No, Ethan, you can't. Silence stretched between them, heavy, unbearable. Then, softer. I'm running out of time. Ethan felt something break inside him. She reached up, touching his face, the first time she had ever done so. Her fingers were warm, paint-stained, real. And in that moment, he realized. She wasn't afraid. She had already accepted it. But he hadn't. He couldn't. Come with me, Ethan said suddenly. To Paris, to anywhere. Let me take care of you. Lena smiled, a sad, knowing smile. And then what? His throat tightened. Then, we figure it out. She exhaled, stepping back. Ethan, you don't understand. My world is getting smaller every day, and when it's gone, when I can't see anymore, I don't want to be someone's burden. His jaw locked. You're not a burden. She looked at him for a long time. But I will be. Silence. Cold, cruel silence. And then, barely above a whisper, I love you, Ethan. It was the first time she had said it, and before he could respond, before he could even breathe, she was gone. Ethan stood on that bridge for a long time, staring at the place where she had just been. His world had been built on control, on winning, on never letting anything slip through his fingers. But Lena? She had never belonged to anyone, and now? Now she was just a ghost in his world of logic and precision. And for the first time, Ethan Carter knew what it meant to lose. Ethan Carter had built his life on precision. Every decision, every action, every carefully calculated move had led him to where he was, a billion-dollar empire, a name that carried weight in every boardroom, a life so meticulously structured that there was no room for uncertainty. But Lena had been uncertainty, and now she was gone. Days passed, then weeks. Ethan threw himself into work, as if drowning in numbers and deadlines could erase her from his mind. He attended meetings, signed contracts, made deals that would shape the future of technology itself. But none of it mattered, not when he woke, up in his penthouse, and instinctively reached for his phone, only to remember she wouldn't be calling. Not when he walked through the city and saw the walls where she used to paint, now covered by new, meaningless graffiti. Not when he passed an art supply store and caught himself wondering if she had enough brushes. Not when he sat in his car outside that alley, knowing she wouldn't be there. She was everywhere. And yet, she was nowhere. For the first time in his life, Ethan Carter was lost. It happened on a Thursday. His assistant entered his office holding a small, slightly crumpled envelope, no sender, just his name, written in delicate, familiar handwriting. Ethan's hands trembled as he took it. Inside, a single piece of folded paper. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to leave it behind. I never wanted to disappear from your life, but I knew that if I stayed, you'd never stop trying to save me. You once asked me what I would do if I had all the time in the world. The truth is, I don't. But I still have time, and I need to use it before it's gone. I'm in Paris, not forever. Just long enough to see the world one last time before it fades from view. Long enough to live on my own terms, the way I always have. If you ever loved me, truly loved me, let me go. Lena. Ethan read the letter once, twice, 10 times. Then he did the one thing he hadn't done in years. He walked out of his office, got into his car, and drove with no destination in mind. The city blurred past him, lights, people, sounds, all meaningless, because none of it mattered. Not the billion-dollar deals, not the board meetings, not the empire he had spent his life building. The only thing that mattered was her, and she was slipping away. Ethan had never been the kind of man who acted on impulse. Every decision was measured. Every risk was calculated. But that night, sitting alone in his penthouse with her letter in his hands, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he had a choice that wasn't about power or success. It was about love, and the question wasn't whether he should let her go. It was whether he was willing to lose her forever. And suddenly, he knew he wasn't. Ethan had never been to Paris without an agenda. Every previous visit had been for business, meetings, in glass towers, power lunches overlooking the Seine, carefully orchestrated negotiations that dictated the future of the tech industry. But this time, there was no agenda. There was only her. The moment the plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle, Ethan felt something strange settle in his chest. Something he couldn't name. He had spent his life chasing success. Now, for the first time, he was chasing something that couldn't be measured in numbers or contracts. His hands clenched around Lena's letter, now creased from being read too many times. She was here, somewhere in this city, and he had to find her before it was too late. Paris felt different. Ethan had always admired the city's precision, the sharp efficiency of its business sector, the calculated elegance of its wealth. But now, walking through its streets with her on his mind, he saw it differently, the art, the chaos, the life. Everywhere he turned, he saw flashes of Lena. A girl sketching by the river reminded him of the way she used to get lost in her work. A street performer humming a quiet melody brought back the sound of her laughter. The city was alive with color, but Ethan knew that for Lena, those colors were fading, and soon they'd be gone forever. He searched for days. He checked art galleries, cafes, anywhere she might be. He spoke to local artists, described her, even bribed a gallery owner to let him check their records, but she was nowhere. And just as despair started to creep in, just as he began to wonder if he'd lost her for good, he saw it. A mural, massive, breathtaking, undeniably hers. It covered an entire wall near Montmartre, its colors bold and defiant, yet heartbreakingly delicate. A woman with her eyes closed, standing in the middle of a storm, arms outstretched, as if she could still feel the world around her, even as it disappeared. Beneath it, in small, almost imperceptible script, "For the things I can no longer see, but will always remember." Ethan's breath caught. She was here. She had to be. The sun was setting when he found her. She was sitting alone on the steps of the Sacré-Cœur, a sketchbook in her lap, though she wasn't drawing. She was just staring, or at least trying. Ethan hesitated. For the first time since he had arrived, he felt uncertain. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she asked him to leave? But then, as if sensing him, Lena turned her head slightly, and even though she couldn't quite see him anymore, she knew, a small smile, a whisper of breath. "You found me." Ethan swallowed hard, stepping forward. "Of course I did." Her fingers tightened around the edges of her sketchbook. I told you to let me go." "I know." He sat beside her, their shoulders barely touching. "I didn't." Silence. And then, in a voice so soft he almost missed it, "I was afraid you wouldn't come." Ethan exhaled, something breaking inside him, and then, finally, he reached for her hand, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. They sat there for a long time. No words. No need for explanations, just the quiet hum of Paris, the warmth of her hand in his, and the knowledge that whatever happened next, they were here, together. Paris was quiet that night. The streets, usually filled with life, felt different, slower, softer, almost waiting. Ethan and Lena walked side by side, their steps unhurried, as if neither of them wanted to reach their destination. The city stretched around them in gold and shadow, and for the first time since he had arrived, Ethan wasn't thinking about time or loss, just her. Lena hadn't spoken much since they left the steps of the Sacré-Cœur. She walked close, sometimes, brushing against him, sometimes reaching out as if memorizing the shape of the world before it disappeared. Ethan wanted to ask her 1,000 things. How much could she still see? Was she afraid? Did she regret leaving? But instead he just walked beside her because deep down he already knew the answers. Finally she stopped. They had reached the river. The Seine moved slowly beneath the bridges, shimmering in the fading light. Lena exhaled, gripping the stone railing, eyes fixed on something Ethan couldn't see. "I can barely make out the lights now," she admitted. "They're just blurs." Ethan swallowed. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to stay." His jaw tightened. "You think I came all this way just to walk away?" She sighed. "Ethan, when it's gone, when everything is dark, I won't be the same." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Neither will I." She let out a soft, broken laugh. "You don't get it. You'll have to help me with everything. I won't be able to see your face. I won't even know if you're still looking at me the way you do now." Ethan cupped her face gently, forcing her to feel his presence. "Then I'll tell you," he murmured. "Every day." Her lips trembled. "What if I don't want that?" He searched her face. "Do you?" A long pause, then barely above a whisper. "No." The confession hung between them. Lena turned away, gripping the stone railing like it was the only thing keeping her steady. "I'm terrified, Ethan. Not of being blind, not really, but of—" She trailed off. He waited. She exhaled. "Of you. Seeing me like that. Of you staying out of pity, of waking up one day and realizing you regret it." His grip on her tightened. "That's not who I am." She shook her head. "You don't know that." "I do." Silence. The wind picked up, sending strands of her hair across her face. She closed her eyes. "Ethan." And he knew. This was it. This was the moment she would push him away forever. Unless, "I love you." The words left him before he could. Stop them, raw and certain. I don't love you because of what you see, or because of the way you paint, or because of who you were before this. I love you, Lena, every part of you. Her breath caught, he stepped closer. And if your world goes dark, then I'll learn how to live in the dark with you. Tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head as if trying to fight them, but she wasn't fighting him anymore, and that was all Ethan needed. He pulled her into his arms, and this time, she let him. In the beginning, it was the small things that hurt the most. The way Lena would reach for a light switch, only to remember she no longer needed it. The way she would sit by a window, tilting her head as if trying to capture the last echoes of sunlight. The way she would pause before stepping into a room, her body hesitating, waiting for something her eyes could no longer give her. It was in those moments that Ethan felt the weight of it all, the silent war she fought, the unspoken grief of a world that had quietly slipped away from her. And yet, Lena never let herself break. The hardest part, she once admitted, wasn't losing sight itself. It was losing the details. I used to know exactly how blue the sky was, she murmured one evening, curled against Ethan's chest. Now, when I think of it, I wonder, am I remembering the right shade? Or is it just something my mind made up? Ethan ran his fingers through her hair, pressing a kiss to her forehead. It's still there. She let out a breath. I wish I could be sure. He took her hand, guiding it to his face. Then feel it, the way you always did. The sky was never just about color, Lena. It was the warmth on your skin, the sound of birds against it, the way the wind changed right before it rained. She closed her fingers over his jawline, tracing the sharp edges. And you, she whispered, how do I remember you? Ethan caught her hand and brought it to his lips. Like this, she smiled, but there was a sadness beneath it. It's not the same. No, he admitted, but it's ours. Lena had always been an artist. She had painted with her eyes first, and her hands second. Now, her hands had to learn to see for her. Ethan watched as she adapted, as she ran her fingertips over objects with a quiet patience, mapping their textures, memorizing their weight. He watched as she trailed her hands across bookshelves, learning where each volume belonged, not by the titles, but by the thickness of the spines. He watched as she learned to pour her own coffee by placing her finger just inside the rim of the cup, feeling the rising warmth before it spilled over. And one evening, he watched as she sat before a blank canvas, her fingers ghosting over the surface, her breathing slow and uncertain. He sat beside her, silent, waiting. Finally, she dipped her fingers into the paint, and for the first time since she had lost her sight, she painted. Ethan never asked if she missed seeing him. Some nights, when they lay in the dark, she would reach for his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his features as if trying to recreate them in her mind. She would pause at his lips, waiting, and Ethan would kiss her fingertips, letting her know he was still there. She no longer saw him, but she felt him, and sometimes that was enough. It started with an idea, a whisper of inspiration that refused to leave her. Lena hadn't touched a canvas since that night she painted with her fingers, but something inside her stirred, a need, a longing, a hunger. She needed to create, not for the world, not for anyone else, but for herself. One afternoon, while Ethan was working in the next room, Lena sat on the floor of their small Paris apartment, surrounded by brushes, paints, and uncertainty. She had been afraid of this moment, of failing, of proving to herself that she couldn't do it anymore. But then she felt his presence. Ethan knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "What do you need?" she swallowed. "I don't know." He reached for a brush, placed it in her palm. "Then let's find out." She hesitated. "Ethan, I'm not here to help," he said softly. "I'm just here, that's all." Pause, and then she began. At first it was slow, tentative. Lena moved the brush across the canvas, uncertain, feeling her way through each stroke. She relied on instinct, on memory, on the echoes of color that still lived somewhere deep inside her. Ethan watched in silence. She painted by touch, feeling the weight of the brush, the smooth glide of the bristles. She let the paint guide her, let the textures speak to her in a way her eyes no longer could. And as the hours passed, something shifted. Her movements became freer, more fluid. She wasn't trying to remember what the world looked like anymore. She was painting what it felt like. When she finally put the brush down, Ethan exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. Lena's hands were covered in paint. Her face was flushed, but there was something else, a piece that hadn't been there before. She turned to him, hesitant. "Tell me." Ethan stood, stepping back to take it in, and for the first time in his life, words failed him. The painting was raw, breathtaking, unlike anything she had ever done before. It wasn't realism, it wasn't abstract, it was her. It was touch. It was sound. It was the way she felt the world now, all captured in color and movement. Ethan's throat tightened. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Lena let out a shaky breath. "You're just saying that." He stepped closer, taking her paint-covered hands in his. "No, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And in that moment she knew. She hadn't lost everything. She had found something new. Paris had changed, or maybe they had. The streets were still the same, the cafes still filled with the same laughter, the river still carrying the same quiet whispers of the city. But for Lena, the world was no longer about what could be seen. It was about the way the cobblestones felt beneath her fingertips when she crouched to touch them. It was about the scent of rain before it fell, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the rhythm of footsteps blending into the heartbeat of the city, and it was about him, Ethan, always by her side. Not as a guide, not as a savior, but as someone who had chosen to walk through the darkness with her, step by step. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop of their apartment, Lena turned to Ethan. "Do you ever wonder?" He glanced at her. "Wonder what?" "What it would have been like if we had met under different circumstances. If I weren't," she hesitated, "if I weren't blind." Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then he reached for her hand. "Maybe we wouldn't have fallen in love." Lena frowned. "What?" He smiled softly. "Maybe I would have been too caught up in my world. Maybe you would have been too lost in yours. Maybe we would have passed each other 1,000 times in New York and never even noticed." Lena let out a breath, her fingers tightening around his. "But this way," he continued, "we had to see each other, really see." A long pause. Then Lena laughed, a soft, beautiful sound like the first notes of a song. "Ethan," she whispered. He pulled her closer. "What?" She tilted her face up toward him, though her gaze was unfocused. "I don't need to see you," she murmured, "because I already know exactly what you look like." Ethan swallowed, pressing his forehead against hers. "Tell me." A small smile. "You look like home." And just like that, nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the fear, not even the darkness. Because in each other, they had found something greater, something that had no shape, no color, no need for sight, something infinite. Time passed, the seasons shifted. Painting the world in colors Lena could no longer see, but she felt them in the crispness of the air, in the scent of blooming flowers, in the way people's voices changed when spring arrived. She and Ethan had built a life, not in the way she once imagined, but in a way that felt even more real. Her paintings had become something unique, something beyond sight. Art critics spoke about how they could feel her work before they could even analyze it, how her paintings carried an energy, a movement, a voice. She never told them that it was because she painted with her hands, her memory, and most of all, with the way Ethan described the world to her. She didn't need her eyes when she had his. Words, a life in the dark, but never alone. They still walked the streets of Paris at night, just as they had when she could see. Only now, Ethan would describe everything to her, the way the moonlight touched the rooftops, the color of the river under the street lamps, the way people moved through the city, unaware that every detail was being captured in Lena's mind. Sometimes, she would stop, turn toward him, and smile. And he knew she could see it, not with her eyes, but with her heart, a love that needed no light one evening. As they lay in bed, Lena traced her fingers over Ethan's face. She had done it 100 times before, but tonight there was something different in the air, something quiet and certain. Ethan caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "What is it?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Marry me." A sharp intake of breath. Then, "Lena," he murmured, his voice unsteady. "You were supposed to let me ask you first," she smiled. "I figured I'd save you the trouble." Pause. Then Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "You really think I'd ever say no?" She grinned. "I was hoping not." And when he pulled her into his arms, when he kissed her like they had all the time in the world, she knew she had never lost anything. She had only found more than she ever thought possible.